And what American Anglicanism lacks at the moment, actually, I think probably world Anglicanism lacks at the moment, is this basic, orthodox, middle of the road Anglican theology that's not embarrassed about itself.
Welcome to the Curious Curate. I'm your host, and today we are excited to welcome our guest, the Most Reverend Peter Robinson, who is the presiding bishop of the United Episcopal Church of North America. He also serves as the ordinary of the Missionary Diocese of the East and rector of Good Shepherd Anglican Church in Waynesboro, Virginia. I'm so excited to have Bishop Robinson on for many reasons, but this day we're going to interview him particular about a journal article he wrote in Cranmer Theological Journal about the old High Church or the High Church tradition. This is a High Church today means many different things to many different people. Perhaps for some of you who are listening, you might associate that with high ritual and Anglo-Catholic, Anglo-Catholic theology. And the purpose of this interview today is to clarify the original sense of the term high church. What did it mean in its own context? What is the history of that term? What is the theology behind the movement of the high church movement earlier on in the Anglican tradition? And so, in order to unearth this high church tradition, we're going to explore some historical contours about this group and ask Dr. Robinson some questions. So, I'm so grateful to have you on, Dr. Robinson. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Strictly speaking, not a doctor. I have an honorary doctorate. I don't have an earned one.
I will edit that out. I will just say thank you for having us on, for coming on, Bishop Robinson.
That's okay.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to start off with our first question. In your paper, you mention in the introduction kind of this tension with the high church movement and what it has become today. And you contrast it to the Tractarian movement, which in some ways is kind of maybe a less general way of saying is hijacked the term high church. And I would love for our listeners who are not aware of what the Tractarian movement is, if you could just briefly explain what the Tractarian movement was as a historical movement, and then also explain how their influence has made high church synonymous with the Tractarian movement today in many circles.
Okay, the Tractarians originally are kind of a subset of churchmanship. And in the theological, political, and social crisis that surrounds the end of the confessional state in England in the 1820s, they become kind of radicalized. And they have a very strong tendency to emphasize the authority of the church as an apostolic institution. Now, most of what you read in the Tracts for the Times, which are 90 tracts published between 1833 and 1841, is actually pretty uncontroversial. But there are odd things like Isaac Williams' tract on reserving communicating religious knowledge, the notorious tract 90 that brings the series to an end, which points to a more dynamic understanding of history and of the patristic witness, which as time progresses in the 19th century, the Tractarians, with their sort of radical, romantic high churchmanship, eventually make contact with the more romantic movement, which is the Cambridge Camden Society, or as it became in the 1840s, the Ecclesiastical Society. And where those two cross over, you have ritualism, which is the immediate ancestor of Anglo-Catholicism. Now, Anglo-Catholicism itself splits between what I would call prayer book Catholics and Anglo-Papalists. The prayer book Catholics at least try and remain rooted in the Anglican tradition. The Anglo-Papalists tend to borrow, Mama Roma's old clothes. both theologically and liturgically. So you get a group emerging at the end of the 19th century that has very little use for the Church of England except for the public position that it can give them.
Hmm.
Because theologically, really their heart is in Rome or with the old Catholics. It's not really with historical Anglicanism. Now, what tends to happen is high churchmanship becomes, rather than the older meaning, which is a high view of the prerogatives of the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, the term High Church came out of the exclusion crisis in the 1670s when the more strongly Protestant MPs were trying to exclude the Catholic James Duke of York from the succession. And high meant you were high for the Church of England. You strongly supported its theology, you strongly supported the institution of bishops, you strongly supported its dominance of both the political and religious life of the country. And it was generally associated with the Tory party.
Mm-hmm.
The contrary point of view, those who had a low view of the prerogatives of the Church of England, tended to go with a more sort of pan-Protestant approach. So it draws its support from Scottish Whigs, former Puritans, those who are very worried about the implications of the Catholic James
Mm-hmm.
coming to the throne after the death of Charles II.
Right.
And the Low Churchological movement, which is called Latitudinarianism. And the original Low Churchmen basically tended to downplay the distinctives of Anglicanism, whereas the High Churchmen tended to play them up.
Right.
That's a really simple way of looking at
Yeah,
it. And then
that's very
term,
helpful. I wanted to piggyback on one thing you said about the influence of Romanticism and kind of the metaphysical air in the room of the 19th century. What would be the distinction? Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but what would be the distinction between the high churchmen of the sense that you just described and their kind of the way that they dealt with Romanticism, and what were their foundational principles that were different than, I guess, the later ritualists who kind of were all swept up in Romanticism?
what it comes down to at the end of the day is the old High Churchmen were a product very much of the 17th and 18th century tendency towards what I would call realism, or common sense. They tend to establish the facts on the basis of history, the patristic witness. It's a very sort of common sense theology.
Mm, yeah.
There's much more magic and moonlight to the Tractarian approach. And
Hmm.
you can sort of see it in the arts coming out of Germany from about 1780. You're getting into the world of Goethe. And also, you've got the influence of Hegelianism, which, although it's not strong in England, it's kind of in the water.
Sure.
And there's a whole sort of misty, romantic glow to this period. Things like the revival of the Order of St. John in Germany,
Yep.
the interest in completing Cologne Cathedral.
Hmm.
In England, you have the movement to restore churches. You have the first manifestations of Romanticism in England very often are, incorporating a medieval ruin into your landscape garden.
Yeah.
The,
Yeah.
the picturesque.
Right.
Uh, the Gothic novel that Jane Austen parodies in Northanger Abbey, that's an early manifestation of
Sure.
Romanticism in the broader English culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
The poetry of Wordsworth.
Hmm.
You get this. It's a much more sort of naturalistic, has a tendency towards naturalism, medievalism, a love of mystery, of symbolism.
Yeah.
It's kind of a reaction against the sheer rationality
Hmm.
of the
Yeah.
18th century.
And my next question ties into that. You suggest in your article that Anglo-Catholicism, quote, served to weaken Anglican identity, end quote. Um, why is that the case? And in what ways has this specifically manifested itself in the mainstream Anglican Communion? So how did Anglo-Catholicism as a movement serve to weaken Anglican identity, and how do we see that manifested in the 21st century today?
Uh, the really simple way of putting it is the later Anglo Catholics had no use for the 39 Articles or the prayer book. They were perpetually either explaining them away in the case of the 39 Articles or supplementing them in the case of the prayer book. So that in and of itself weakens two of the major documentary bases of Anglican theology. The way that is manifested in the 20th century is a gradual loosening of the theological standards within Anglicanism to accommodate both Anglo-Catholicism and liberalism. I always have a little bit of an unkind joke that modern Anglican liberalism and modern Anglo-Catholicism both originate at opposite ends of the senior common room at Oriel College in Oxford in the late 1820s, because you have Blanco White, Whately, and Hawkins, who are basically the three figures around which the Noetic Party formed. And they are really the grandfathers of liberalism. They influenced people like Archibald Campbell Tate, Frederick Temple, um, who are really the early Anglican liberals, although their liberalism, by modern standards, will look almost like fundamentalism.
Mhm.
It's the crack in the dam, it's not the dam collapsing. At the other end of the room, you've got Dr. Pusey was actually a Christ Church man, but you've got John Henry Newman, Keble, Earl Froude, who are bound up with this rediscovery of the patristic basis of Anglicanism, which has detached itself through the teaching of Charles Lloyd to some degree from the historical Anglican formularies. Now, both tendencies, if you fast forward over the next 150 years, tend to make for an atmosphere where there are no absolute standards of authority. Scripture becomes culturally conditioned. That's a liberal influence. The 39 Articles are not binding, which is an Anglo-Catholic influence. The prayer book needs revision, which comes from both sides.
Mhm.
And this gradually waters down the content of Anglicanism. So basically, Anglicanism becomes a movement with an Episcopal form of church government and some sort of vague reference back to the Church of England.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm this is very helpful to set up. And part of why I want to ask these questions is because I'm in Generation Z. I entered into Anglicanism with the ripple effects of what you just described. And the the way that it's conceptualized, Anglicanism, is this three streams. You have three options. You have the evangelical option, you have the charismatic option, and then you have the Anglo-Catholic option. And the High Church and Anglo-Catholic are synonymous. And when that is what is presented to you, without knowing the history, it makes sense why one might choose this Anglo-Catholic stream as it exists today. But the old High Churchmen, unfortunately, the reason I'm discussing this is because they're so unknown, and I think people with more Protestant proclivities, if they were to hear about this tradition within Anglicanism, as I encountered through stumbling upon Bishop John Henry Hobart's Apology for the Church of Apology for Apostolic Order, which was this robust defense of ecclesiology using the reformers, using the reformers embracing the Reformation and the patristics was eye-opening for me. And so that's kind of my heart behind this interview. And so I'm so glad you set up that historical context here because it's so important to understand. So now that we kind of established the historical context of why we are in some ways, or why we are where we are today, I wanted now to get into actually the old High Churchmen, their theology, some figures, and some ways that interacted with those first generation Tractarians. So my first question in this along these lines is you hit on it a little bit, but what is the origin of the High Churchmen? Is it a movement that appeared in the 18th century, just a century earlier from the Tractarians, or does the old High Churchman tradition have a continuity back to the first generation reformers and the Caroline Divines?
Yeah, what you have is from the very beginning of Anglicanism, or rather, I should say, from the English Reformation onwards, you have a tension. And on the one hand, you have a stream which is essentially Philippist in its outlook. Now, Philip Melanchthon, you tend to think of Philip Melanchthon as being, if Martin Luther's Batman, he's Robin. And actually, what that ignores is the fact that Philip Melanchthon was quite independent. And Melanchthon was close friends with Martin Bucer. Now, the reason the name Bucer is important is Bucer not only worked with Melanchthon to produce the Cologne Church Order of 1543, which was deeply influential on the Book of Common Prayer. He also produced De Regni Christi, which would have influenced the English Reformation had Edward VI lived longer. He's also Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, 1549 to 1551. And Melanchthon and Bucer between them represent sort of the two theological poles of the early English Reformation. Melanchthon they're both humanists, they're both Christian humanists. They both come out of that Rhineland environment where Erasmus was very influential. Bucer ultimately is a moderating figure, but he is also responsible for many of the major ideas we think of as being Calvin's, because Calvin basically received his higher theological education in Strasbourg under Bucer in the late 1530s, early 1540s, after he got kicked out of Geneva. Melanchthon's Loci Communes is the first Protestant textbook to be used in the English universities. So you get this kind of Rhineland theology coming into England, and there's a tension in it. One side of it wants to be sacramental and ecclesiastical. The other side wants to emphasize the sovereignty of God, predestination and election, etc. During the reign of Elizabeth I, those two sides begin to pull apart because you have the influence of Bullinger's Zurich and Calvin's Geneva, which pull more in we would tend to call it Calvinistic direction. A moderate Reformed tradition that is associated with Bucer and is transmitted through people like Matthew Parker,
Mm-hmm.
who was quite close to Bucer during the 3 years that he was in Cambridge. Then you have a more conservative set in some ways emerging in the middle of Elizabeth I's reign, people like Lancelot Andrewes, Richard Hooker, who, although they're absolutely steeped in contemporary Reformed theology, also are beginning to engage more with the early fathers.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this mix of Reformed theology, patristic engagement, and Anglican liturgy.
Yeah.
Produces various proto-high churchmen, William Laud, Richard Neal, John Cosin. They're all upholding high church principles long before the term high church comes into use. I mean, Their enemies gave them various names over the years. The first one they threw at them was Lutherans
Uh-huh.
because uh, because they didn't accept double predestination. And also they had a fairly high liturgical standard. Then they discovered the wonderful word, they discovered the word Arminian.
Hmm.
English Arminianism has very little to do with Dutch Arminianism, except for the rejection of the harsher forms of predestination.
Sure.
But, in a theological argument, it was a good enough stick with which to beat the dog.
Right. Yeah.
They're sometimes referred to as Laudians, but the High Church term emerges in the 1670s, long after actually the High Church party had become somewhat dominant in the Church of England, because the religious and political atmosphere after 1660 favoured the High Churchmen. The king has been restored. Puritanism is partially discredited by its association with rebellion and regicide. Philosophically, theology is moving into an age of pietism and rationalism, neither of which really suits the Puritans. The last flowering of the old Puritanism is really the Westminster Standards.
Hmm.
And of course, it lives on because, the guys who are writing in the 1640s were born at the beginning of the century. The old Puritanism continues into the end of the century, and of course migrates quite successfully to North America, where you will find it at Princeton and Harvard. Yale was always a little bit kind of the loose side.
Right. Yeah.
High churchmanship in the United States is mainly associated before the Revolution with New England, but that's probably a Tractarian reading back into church history, because the missions in New England were directly under SPG in London, Society
Yes,
for
they
the
were.
Propagation.
Yep.
And SPG was in a high church organ. And as such, the guys who were ordained under the aegis of SPG tended to be old-fashioned high churchmen.
Yep. The Yale apostasy and
Exactly.
Samuel Seabury and those folks had a high ecclesiology, but and this is I don't mean to interrupt, but this is a phenomenon that you hinted at, where often the modern day Anglo-Catholic Party will read into these figures and see a continuity there on the mere basis of really just their ecclesiology and their and their more, Arminian proclivities. It seems to be the only continuity. So what in what ways were these men in their times different than the later Tractarian movement? Is it just the ecclesiology that was similar? Is it fair to read back for them and say that these are their forefathers in their movement, or is it not?
Oh, that is actually quite a complicated question to
Okay.
address. Tractarianism and the old high churchmen share certain characteristics: high ecclesiology, a high view of the sacraments, a rejection of the more extreme forms of predestination. Where they differ is the old high churchmen tend to read the early fathers through Anglican spectacles, whereas the Tractarians read Anglicanism through patristic spectacles.
Okay.
One of the problems with the early fathers, as anybody will tell you who educates clergy, is you really can't turn a student loose in the wild writing without some sort of a roadmap. Else they will fall in love with every dodgy position that was held in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, before they eventually get their heads straight, at which point they've probably gone over to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is a whole different set of dodgy propositions. The long and the short of the matter, it is this difference. The old High Churchmen read the early fathers through Anglican spectacles. The Tractarians read Anglicanism through patristic spectacles. Uh, they're similar but different. They work differently. And as such, the tendency of the Tractarians is to abandon the Reformation heritage of the Church. And of course, what causes the first big breach between the old High Churchmen and the Tractarians is the publication of Froude's Remains, which, if my memory serves me correctly, is 1839. And, you know, the unguarded letters of a young man who's going through some sort of a religious crisis really should not have been published. And when Froude uses phrases like, I really do hate the reformers more and more, as one of his letters, I think, to Newman says, that really did cause some rattling of the teacups in conventional high church circles. And when you're looking at the bench of bishops in the first couple of years of the reign of Queen Victoria, most of the English bishops were high churchmen.
Mm-hmm.
The most conspicuous exception was Edward Maltby, who was a fairly colourless Whig, who was Bishop of Norwich forever for the simple reason he got on the wrong side of a political debate very early in his career and got left at Norwich. Kind of punishment. He was there 31 years. The rest were various shades of high churchmen. Some, like William Van Mildert, William Hooley, Charles Blumfield, Henry Philpotts, were directly associated with the Hackney Phalanx, which was kind of the clearinghouse for the more influential old High Churchmen. The Hackney Phalanx is a wonderful example of high church non-organization in that Joshua Watson, leading layman of the time, was a passionate high churchman of the old school. And his house in Hackney became a kind of clubhouse for all the various, you know, the high churchmen of the period. And of course, being well placed politically, he could recommend people to Lord Liverpool or the Duke of Wellington for appointment as bishops. And also, he encouraged a certain measure of what I would call low-key reform. So things like the creation of the Diocese of Ripon in 1836, the Dean and Chapter Act of 1840, were reforming measures that were sort of cooked up by the old high churchmen, basically to save the Church of England from disestablishment. The Tractarians, having the benefit of not being an authority, opposed these reforming measures tooth and nail because, you know, they didn't have the responsibility of navigating the Church of England through a very difficult period. Now, theologically, the old high churchmen are chiefly characterized by accepting the idea that the threefold ministry of bishop, priest, and deacon is apostolic in origin. They also accepted the relationship between church and state as it existed in England from the Reformation down to 1828 to 1832. They also had a high view of baptism as conveying regeneration, but the word regeneration in the 18th century does not mean what it means in 19th century American theology. Because in the Second Great Awakening, regeneration becomes, whereas in older writers such as, for example, Daniel Waterland, who's the archetypal early 18th century Anglican theologian of the High Church type, Regeneration basically was coming into a covenant relationship through Christ, which would lead to your salvation if you followed through.
Hmm.
If you did not obstruct the grace of God and the Holy Spirit working within you.
Hmm.
On the other hand, also characteristic of these old High Church means a high view of Holy Communion.
Yeah.
Now, this is one area in which there's a noticeable difference from the later Anglo-Catholics. As Harold Brown describes it, the real spiritual presence was the Anglican, the old high Anglican position.
Yeah.
And he describes it as being essentially the position of Calvin.
Right. Yeah.
It actually comes from Butzer originally, but,
Sure. Yeah.
and of course, Butzer was always trying to make peace between Zurich and Wittenberg.
Right.
So what you have through Butzer's influence is an idea that although the bread and the wine remain bread and wine, there is an element of objectivity to the spiritual benefit, i.e. the reception of the body and blood of Christ spiritually, that is far more than a airy-fairy receptionism.
Sure. Yeah.
So, for example, Johnson of Cranbrook, writing at the beginning of the 1700s, he describes his understanding of what happens in the Eucharist as being that the bread and the wine become, in virtue, power, and effect, the body and blood of Christ. He doesn't argue for a physical change. What he argues for is a change of significance.
Yeah.
Hence, his variant of the real spiritual presence is known as virtualism because of his use of the word virtue.
Yeah.
In terms of how they dealt with predestination, the old High Churchmen tend towards some form of corporate election.
Yes, and while you continue on that, how did their baptismal theology relate to their view of predestination and vice versa? I'm sure you're going to hit on that, but I think the two are related.
When you get theologically, if you look back into 16th century Reformed theology, say the Heidelberg Catechism, what you have is a high view of predestination coupled with a high view of baptism. What happens over time is people start choosing sides.
Hmm.
So the tendency in the 18th century is for a high view of the sovereignty of God to lead to a low view of the sacraments. And the ultimate manifestation of that is in the early 19th century with basically the Princeton School of Presbyterian theologians. On the other hand, if you have a high view of the sacraments, which is characteristic of, just to use a convenient name, Lancelot Andrewes and his spiritual descendants, you will have a tendency to play down predestination and election. Not so much because you don't believe in election, but because you see an overemphasis on election as undermining both ecclesiology and sacramental theology.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, there is a danger with a predestinarian theology that salvation becomes about the individual and the church is secondary.
Right, right. So there's more of like an Augustinian synthesis, is maybe one way to put it.
What happens is ultimately kind of makes the church redundant, which is what happens with some of the hyper-Calvinist groups or rather groups that have their roots in hyper-Calvinism, like the Plymouth Brethren.
Mm-hmm.
The church eventually is reduced basically to a fellowship.
Yeah.
It's not a sacramental body anymore. As a result of this, the old High Church tend towards corporate election, whereby the elect is the baptized. and out of that elect come the saved. I draw
Yeah.
the analogy between that and circumcision under the Old Covenant,
Hmm.
which is interesting because that is a common Reformed apologetic for infant baptism in the 16th century when they're arguing with the Anabaptists, which again is a neat little demonstration of the degree to which the old High Churchmen remained rooted in
Yeah.
the older forms of Reformed theology.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, the difference between them and the Tractarians is this roots 16th century theology. They may not be reading the stuff directly, but if you look, for example, at Tomlin's reading list for ordination candidates, there's a lot of guys like Mosheim in there who were sort of the sort of mainstream Protestant go-tos of the 18th century. And that tells you that the old High Churchman was still very much rooted in the Protestant tradition. So when you get into the 1840s, this has a very sort of concrete manifestation in the form of another Tractarian causes another Tractarian nightmare, which is the Jerusalem bishopric.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of church historians get this wrong. It was not Anglo-German, it was Anglo-Prussian. And that is an important distinction to make because we're before the unification of Germany. Prussia itself had a union church. And this union church has a weird and wonderful history. In 1613, Johann Sigismund, who was the then elector of Brandenburg, converted from Lutheranism to Calvinism. Well, kind of. What you get in the court in Berlin is they retain the Augsburg Confession and Luther's Small Catechism. They embrace the Heidelberg Catechism and the Palatine Liturgy, or a variant of the Palatine Liturgy, and also this document called the Confession of Johann Sigismund. It rejects some of the more extreme Calvinist positions. So you've got, in the court circles, you've got a moderate Reformed stance. The rest of the country is Lutheran, because they won't go along with the elector changing his religion. By the end of the century, around 1695, 1700, they're looking at ways to bring the two sides together. And Jablonski, who is the court preacher in Königsberg, translates the 39 articles in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer into German because the king is interested in, by this time, Prussia had made itself a kingdom. The king is interested in using Anglicanism, the Anglican formula is, to draw the Calvinist and the Reformed and the Lutheran sides of his kingdom together.
Mm.
Jablonski himself is interesting because he's a bishop.
Hmm.
He received his orders from the Bohemian Brethren, the Unitas Fratrum.
Hmm.
His grandfather was one of the last of the Bohemian bishops.
Hmm.
We, I haven't got this one documented yet, but I think the grandfather consecrated Jablonski. Jablonski consecrated the first two Moravian bishops, which is where the Moravians got their apostolic succession from. Now, the Moravians participated in consecrations in the Free Church of England back in the 1930s and the 1950s. Wow. Kind of as a side note, also the Moravians, the Reformed, the Lutherans, and the Episcopalians down the Shenandoah Valley and into North Carolina all tended to work together.
Yeah. I wanted to just interject here on this. You're describing the difference of, you mentioned this in your article, that the Tractarians tended to use apostolic succession and a high view of the episcopate as a way to unchurch others. You see that there was a different posture in which how the old high churchmen hold a high episcopacy, and it seems what you're describing is this
Mm.
um, receiving the gift of apostolic succession and trying to find ways to offer that gift in unity for the pursuit of visible unity,
Yeah.
still an emphasis and a desire for visible unity, and not to just hold it, but to try to share it. And I guess one of my questions is, you know, we see in the 17th century the Caroline divines have a lot of charity to the continental reform and their situation of not having an episcopate. Now, the Hungarians, which I'm Hungarian, they're the one other, seems to be one of the few other reformed countries that retain episcopacy
Yeah.
in some shape or form. But looking, now centuries and centuries later, with ample opportunity now for some of these communions to receive episcopacy and apostolic succession. Um, is there a point in which there's a point in which the
Um,
posture towards those who are still resisting episcopacy and there's no more governmental pressure, do they enter into the category of maybe where the Presbyterians, the nonconformists were held? How does that, in your view, how does the old high church disposition work today? You describe these moments of unity, but not to unchurch, but what's the burden? How does the high churchman hold his episcopacy, and what burden is there and to implore other communions to embrace this apostolic mode of church structure? Yeah.
right. I think there's three or four different issues here. The first
Yeah, there's
issue is
several in there.
on
So pick whichever one comes
what
you want to answer.
yeah, on what basis do the old high churchmen hold with episcopacy? One thing you will notice about the 39 Articles is it has two bites of the cherry on the subject of ministry. Um, the first time round, it simply states that an organized, a duly called and appointed ministry is necessary.
Hmm.
The second time around, it talks about bishops' and part of the background thinking of the old high churchmen. So the charitable towards the Continental Reformed and the Lutherans, because generally they had lost episcopacy through no fault of their own.
Right. Yes.
There was either a direct theological reason or a direct political reason for them not continuing with the historic episcopate. So, for example, in Denmark, the old bishops were so associated with the old king that when the disputed succession was sorted out, the new king cleaned house
Hmm.
and had Bugenhagen consecrate a tribe of superintendents,
Hmm.
which are the basis of the modern Danish episcopate. In Sweden, they preserved the apostolic succession because the bishops, what few there were, had tended to side with Gustavus Vasa against the Danes. In Germany, every pocket principality sorted out its own reformation. So the odds for preserving the historic episcopate in Germany were never that good.
Sure. Yeah.
Plus, in late medieval theology, they were not sure that episcopacy and the priesthood were two separate orders. There's a kind of a sense that the bishop enjoys in full what the priest has potentially with regards to the power of ordination. So when Luther gets stuck, it is easy for him to say, this is an emergency, we can carry on an historic ministry through ordination by priests,
Yes. And
which
I
is
think that,
what he
that
does.
clarification of the emergency situation of the first generation is
Yeah.
important to remember in all of that.
Now, fast forward to the middle of the 17th century, where you do have staunch advocates of episcopacy, for instance, John Cosin.
Hmm.
Cosin was fine with the idea of receiving communion with the Huguenots when he was in France,
Hmm.
because circumstances in France had not allowed them to acquire an episcopal order. By the same token, Cousin is one of those who takes a strong line against domestic dissenters when he becomes
Yes.
Bishop of Durham in 1660.
Right.
So it really is a case of circumstances alters cases.
Yes.
The Tractarians have a mindset of the church must be episcopally governed, therefore the only true churches are us, the Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Oriental Orthodox.
Yep.
And that is an inversion of the old High Church position. The old High Church position allowed them to participate in the Jerusalem Bishopric project.
Yes.
Because they were perfectly happy cooperating with the Prussians, provided there was a bishop.
Right.
And old Friedrich Wilhelm IV was a bit of a romantic, and he went sort of, oh, a Protestant bishop in Jerusalem, oh, goody. And of course, in a piece of absolutely perfect political maneuvering, the first Bishop of Jerusalem is a Prussian-born Jew who converted to Protestantism and was ordained in the Church of England. You know, kind of touches all the bases. And for 50 years, the Jerusalem bishopric functioned quite well until a combination of the Anglo-Catholics at home and the rising tensions between Germany and the British Empire on the international stage, because this is basically the Jerusalem bishopric idea falls apart during the race to carve up Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, the Germans want their share of the goods.
Yeah.
So, you know, Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, and various other bits of Africa fall under German control
Yeah.
when they're carving up Africa. But of course, the British government regards German intrusion into colonial Africa as a challenge to its own interests. And it's this conflict of commercial interests between the German Empire and the British Empire that begins the run-up to World War One.
Mm-hmm.
The outbreak of World War One is propelled by the conflicting commercial interests of Britain, Germany, and France, which the temperature of which is being gradually raised by the competition between those three great powers in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, you know, the Jerusalem bishopric is early collateral damage.
Yeah.
The theological pot having been stirred generously by the ritualists.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's just think of the North American situation today where circumstantially there's no established, church, and there are no longer political obstacles for the North American jurisdictions of, let's say, Presbyterians or Dutch Reformed. Um, does the old High Church position look more like it did in England with the nonconformists within their own land? How do you think that this position changes in the 21st century for these different jurisdictions that do not have any political obstacles anymore to embrace the episcopate?
At this point, you have to look at them and say, is there some sort of internal obstacle to them
Okay.
embracing episcopacy?
Okay.
In the case of the Presbyterians and the Dutch Reformed, they're both committed to a Presbyterian system of government. The Dutch by the Belgic Confession, and the Presbyterians by the Westminster Standards. Now, a lot of the Dutch Reformed, a lot of the Presbyterians have done the same number on their confessional statements that the Anglican Communion has done on theirs, but it's still in the water. It's still part of the culture.
Sure.
Lutheranism in America is divided. There are some small Lutheran groups like the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, which have bishops in the apostolic succession,
Mm,
generally through either the Swedes by a circuitous route or via the Old Catholics.
yeah.
Um,
The Hungarian Reformed
one
Church would be another one.
the Hungarian Reformed has a form of episcopacy. If they have the apostolic succession, it's through the Bohemian Brethren
Yeah.
and the Moravians. There is a small that has taken episcopacy into its system, the Evangelical and Reformed Synod.
Uh-huh.
Basically because they've always accepted, in a sense, the Episcopal principle. They've always had a president.
Yeah.
And you get into the territory of a rose by any other name.
Mm-hmm.
The presidency was effectively a type of episcopate
Sure.
because he was the guy who went around and visited churches, and he was always there when a pastor was ordained. He functioned like a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there had been old contacts between the German Reformed and Anglicanism and Episcopalianism way back in the day. One of the first German Reformed ministers to serve in America, Johann Heinrich Hager the Younger, he went to a Reformed congregation in New York, but he was ordained by the Bishop of London
Mm-hmm.
on the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Peter Muhlenberg, the gown over uniform guy,
Yes.
and William White were ordained together in London in 1772.
Yes.
So, there's a lot of contact,
Yeah.
and actually probably what does the spread of episcopacy more damage than anything else in the Protestant world is the way the Anglo-Catholics have used it as a weapon to unchurch
Exactly.
non-Episcopal Protestants.
Right. Right. And I'm so grateful that in this interview, I hope that the listeners can see that nuance of how one even holds the doctrine and where that's rooted in is extremely important for the future of
Hmm.
the potential for Protestant unity. And the High Church been very much valued and took Jesus' words in John 17 very seriously, that there is a visible unity that's important through the episcopate, but it's obviously held with a different heart posture because of its embrace of the Reformation and what you said about reading the Reformer, the Anglican formularies in history through the lens of the patristics, or vice versa, and just how that really has far-reaching implications. And so thank you for answering that. As we kind of wrap up here, I have a few rapid fire kind of questions in that
Okay.
in looking ahead, and I've kind of been hinting at the practical Episcopal kind of crisis with other Protestant groups, maybe not a crisis, but the tension. Um, but looking ahead, we kind of went backwards to explore and unearth the High Church tradition. Thank you so much for doing that. Um, in light of the popularity of the three streams theory of Anglo-Catholic, evangelical, and charismatic, particularly thinking about the evangelical Reformed wing and the Anglo-Catholic ritualism wing, um, what can the High Church tradition offer them? How can the High Church tradition, if one were to read the sources, how could that bridge the gap between those two wings? What kind of clarity can it offer both in terms of all that you said about sacramental theology, ecclesiology, etc., but with just a little more succinct form with due to time. But how can it bridge the gap potentially?
Okay, time to get your tin hat on. First of all, the problem with the three streams theory is all three streams have a focus outside of Anglicanism.
Amen.
The charismatics accept a lot of Pentecostal thinking. The Anglo-Catholics accept a lot of late medieval, early modern Roman Catholic thinking. The evangelicals are probably the most at home, but the locus of their Reformed theology tends to be Geneva, not Cambridge.
And certainly a
Uh,
post-Princeton type of Reformed
Yeah,
theology.
all of them tend to pull in a direction that's outside of Anglicanism. What the old High Churchmen, and quite honestly, I would say the old evangelicals like Charles Simeon offered, was a churchmanship that is securely rooted in the Anglican formularies. So the prayer book, the 39 articles, the homilies, the ordinal. It's also a biblical form of theology that is aware of and draws on the early fathers.
Yes.
So if you like, the old high churchmen are the bridge that allow the other groups to talk to each other without it becoming a screaming match between separate traditions within the same organization.
Yeah, that's so helpful.
The tendency of three streams theology is you get crossover groups. So you get
Hmm.
charismatic Catholics, you get evangelical Catholics, you get charismatic evangelicals. And in a way, although these hybrid groups can, in a way, serve as the glue to keep the thing stuck together, there's no sort of mass of Anglican churchmen in the middle
Yeah. Yeah.
um, of the ordained variety. I think a lot of the laity are that way
Yes.
because the laity are rather impervious to the whims of the clergy, God bless them.
Right.
The whims of the clergy have done more damage to Anglicanism than anything else. But the long and the short of the matter is what the old high churchmanship was the glue that glued everything together. And in England, it was kind of rebranded as central churchmanship around 1900. And the vast majority of Church of England parsons would have described themselves as being central churchmen.
Yeah.
In some way, they kind of reference back to this old high church theology, but they didn't really think of themselves as being high church anymore because the Anglo-Catholics had nicked the name.
Right.
And what American Anglicanism lacks at the moment, actually, I think probably world Anglicanism lacks at the moment, is this basic, orthodox, middle of the road Anglican theology that's not embarrassed about itself.
Yes. I think, sorry, continue.
And that actually has an ecumenical purpose because with traditional Anglicanism having connections with both the Reformed and the Lutheran traditions, there is a way in which Anglicanism, if it's true to its own identity, can begin to pull the various strands of magisterial Protestantism together.
Yes. And it seems as though, Anglo-Catholics focus on ecumenism with, based on the, branch theory. Their
Mm-hmm.
emphasis is on a group, the Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which do not even view the orders as valid. And it seems like that is just a wall that's too high to climb. And then when you add, w women's ordination into the mix, just another
Mm-hmm.
obstacle. Whereas there's this whole ripe field of Protestants, and I mean, obviously the Reformed Episcopal Church in its founding has some
Mm-hmm.
questionable motive, but you do see in Bishop Cummings this desire to have the episcopacy as a unifying force and
Yes.
aim towards fellow Protestants. And it's
You
interesting
see,
that this riper harvest in some ways is what's neglected with the opportunity at hand for visible unity
mm,
in that realm. And the emphasis seems to be in an area where there is very little chance of real progress being made as the way the communion stands.
just to run a weird little rabbit, um, Cummins is not a two-dimensional evangelical.
No.
He's very closely associated with W.A. Muhlenberg. He's
Yes.
associated with the Evangelical Association.
Yes.
He was actually made assistant bishop of Kentucky because he was a reconciling figure.
Yeah. People should read Alan Galzo's book on
Yeah,
that.
it has its limitations, but yeah, Gelzo on
Just the historical front. He does a good job of
he
explaining
does
Cummins in that way.
yeah, he's very good on Cummins. But Cummins' outlook is actually not that different
No.
to what you might have found amongst some of the more broad-minded high churchmen of a previous generation.
Exactly. Yes, certainly.
So really what you have, and I think this is Gelso actually is quite right in this, he tends to see Cummins and the group that form around him as being sort of rather old-fashioned Episcopalians
Right.
who are not adapting well to the more sectarian world
Hmm.
that had emerged in the wake of the Second Great Awakening.
Right.
And this isn't unique to Episcopalianism. You also see it, for instance, with the German churches. This is the period, the middle of the 19th century, when you get a definite German Reformed church, a definite Lutheran church in areas where previously there had been Union churches like this part of Virginia. Because what you have in the middle of the 19th century is, with the rise of Romanticism, kind of come full circle on this. With the rise of Romanticism, you're slowly passing from a producer culture to a consumer culture.
Hmm.
And of course, religion becomes a consumer commodity like everything else,
Indeed.
which is actually one of the major problems of American Christianity. But we probably don't have time for that one today.
Maybe it's another conversation for another time.
Maybe
Well,
it is.
I find that so helpful, and you just pose in your conclusion of your article. Um, that the high church tradition, if people should begin to read and explore, I think Brown's commentary on the 39 Articles is a great starting
Mhm.
point. And just to note that the North American, Episcopal Anglican tradition in the Northeast, in New England, our first bishop consecrated was a high church. I mean, this is an American expression of Anglicanism.
But one of the interesting things is that the main vector for high church thought into the American church is actually through William White, who's
Mm.
commonly thought of as being a latitudinarian, but he is the guy who supervised Hobart's education.
Yes, he did.
And later on, he pushes George Tomlin's reading list as the basis of clerical education in the church, the Protestant
Yep.
Episcopal Church. And Tomlin is an old high churchman.
Yes. And I think people look at White in his willingness to concede the episcopate temporarily due to the revolutionary situation, and as an indictment upon him, and it's written that therefore he's a low churchman. But I think in context, he was really just trying to figure out how the Episcopal Church can continue in light of the crisis of the revolution.
If you if you read the case, what White actually does is he maintains the principle of episcopacy, but he is prepared to put it into commission, as it were,
Exactly. Exactly.
temporarily until they can get bishops consecrated.
Right. Well, it was a similar emergency situation as the first generation reformers, and
Exactly.
people don't see
Yeah.
that. Thank you. I want to just close and just I hope people see from this that high churchmanship isn't just a cool fad, but it's a rich part of the tradition. And I think, as you have demonstrated, that it is perhaps the antidote to recover a more explicit Anglican center.
Mhm.
And it actually would aid the three streams movement in terms of giving it a center and a glue.
Mhm.
And so I'm just so grateful, and I'm so grateful for your work. Thank you for that journal article. I will link it in the description down below. Um, I appreciate just you keeping, getting the high church kind of um, writings and thought out there because it's lacking. So Bishop Robinson, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. I hope we can do more and maybe discuss some more of those rabbit trails that we could continue to head into because there's so much to discuss. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. So have I. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. All right, thank you everyone for listening to this interview, and stay tuned.